Back during the height of the 2016 clown craze, where psychos were dressing up and wandering around rural and wooded areas, stalking and terrifying people, I was living in a very isolated and heavily wooded property in Connecticut. My driveway was so long that my house could not be seen from the road, and I never once had a problem with trespassers, so my kids were free to play outside in our yard whenever they wished. One afternoon, I was inside the house on a conference call when my 8-year-old daughter ran into the house, stating that there was a clown in our driveway. For the first several seconds, I was annoyed, because I was convinced she was either playing a joke on me or just seeing things. I excused myself from the call and asked her what she was doing there, and she simply replied, "It's pointing at us." Something in the way she said that made a chill run through me, and I stood up and walked out of the front door and onto the front steps. My daughter pointed and I saw a figure in a pink and blue striped outfit, standing by the tree line, waving and pointing towards my other 2 children, who were still close to the house, but calling over to the clown, asking what it wanted. I immediately called my kids inside and locked my front door. I told them to stay put, grabbed my stun gun from its spot, and got into my car. I called my husband as I drove the car out of the garage and down the driveway, telling him what was going on, and he told me to keep the car doors locked and not to get too close. I decided, at least for the time being, not to call the police, because it would have taken them a good half an hour just to get there, and by then, the clown would likely be gone. I didn't just want to disappear into the house and wait for this person to get bored. I wanted to confront him and tell him to stay away from my property and from my kids. The clown wasn't by the tree line when I left the garage, but I drove down the driveway, into the trees a short way, and saw him jogging away at a brisk pace. When he heard my car coming, he stopped and turned around and looked back towards me. He wasn't wearing a mask, but his face was heavily made up, complete with a clown nose. But what really shook me was that he appeared to be holding a croquet mallet in one of his hands. He waved at me before disappearing into the woods, and I slammed on my brakes and rolled down my window halfway, screaming at him to get the hell off my property. I floored it to the end of my driveway and drove back and forth in the hopes of finding a parked car with a license plate I could report, but there wasn't anything suspicious or out of place. I returned to the house to check on my kids, who were more amused and excited than afraid. Inwardly, I kicked myself for not taking a picture of the clown on my phone, just to have a record of it in case I needed to report it. I told my kids they had to stay inside for the rest of the day and figured that I would never see the clown again. Whoever it was had gotten his kicks and certainly would not risk trespassing on my property again. The kids were asleep, and my husband and I were skimming through Netflix, and I got up to let the cat out. I'm not exactly positive on what I saw, but there was definitely something across the yard. I noticed movement out of the corner of my eye and thought I saw the shadow of something cast by the moon disappearing around the corner. I turned on all the outside lights, and my husband and I looked around, but whatever it was did not reappear. It could have been a deer, I suppose, but the reason I suspect it was the clown was because of the following morning. When I drove my car to the end of the driveway, there was a purple balloon tied to our mailbox, and the little potted plant at the base of the post had been smashed, as if something big, like a mallet, had come down on it. Worried that the balloon was an indicator of some kind, I immediately untied it. The rest of that day passed without incident, and by the following afternoon, I'd forgotten all about the clown until my kids came back inside and told me he was back and pointing at them again. I yelled at the kids to come inside, but this time, instead of getting in the car, I grabbed my phone and stun gun and stupidly charged out of the front door and stomped across the yard, determined to get a picture this time, and at best stun him and hold him down until the cops came and dragged his ass away. I never saw him that time, and instead of just keeping my kids shut inside, I loaded them in the car and drove to my parents'. This time they were a little more spooked by the clown, and I began to become concerned that perhaps my kids were not safe in the yard anymore. I asked them if it was the same clown, and they said it was, and this time he was holding a sledgehammer. I don't know if that was true, or if they were just misidentifying the croquet mallet. The following day, I decided to become a little more proactive. My parents let me borrow their black Labrador named Groucho. He was a friendly dog, but had a tremendously loud bark and was fiercely protective of the kids. For 2 days, nothing happened, and I was starting to hope that the clown had moved on to harass someone else. That's when it happened. I was returning back up the driveway in the car, after getting the mail, when I noticed the clown was sneaking through the woods. Groucho was in the back seat and immediately started barking loud enough to rupture my eardrums. I slammed on my brakes and immediately called the cops and told them that there was a trespasser on my property and he was carrying a weapon. I honestly couldn't tell if he was carrying the croquet mallet through the trees, but I know he had been carrying one before, so I felt I had a reasonable cause to assume. As I was on the phone with the cops, another call came in on my cell from the house. My oldest daughter was crying, saying that there was a clown standing on our back deck, right outside the sliding door. This one was dressed all in orange, with a blue face. I floored it back up the driveway, threw my car into park, and when I reached the garage, I saw the second clown sprinting towards the woods. I opened the rear door, and Groucho tore after the guy like a ballistic missile. He caught the clown right by the tree line, and the guy started screaming as the loyal dog leapt on top of him and tore at his costume. I distinctly heard 2 separate male voices yelling in the trees, though I couldn't make out exactly what was being said. My daughter was still on the line and confirmed to me that all the kids were still inside, so I went after my dog into the woods. When I found Groucho, he was limping slightly. I was infuriated to see that he had been stabbed with what could have been an ice pick or a screwdriver, but he ultimately seemed unbothered by it. When the cops arrived, I gave them my statement, and they searched the woods. About an hour later, I got a call saying that 2 men had been pulled over and arrested several miles away for reckless driving, and one of them had severe dog bites on both legs. Groucho went to the vet and got bandaged up, and fortunately he has been perfectly fine ever since. I never heard any follow-up pertaining to the arrest afterwards, but the whole situation still amazes me. Getting to our house through the woods isn't an easy 2-minute hike. These men had to walk a good 10 to 15 minutes through the thick forest in full clown makeup just to get close enough to see our house, all for the sake of pranking and terrorizing my family, who was just minding their own business. Their motives were completely lost on me, and the more research I did on this whole clown thing, the more I think it was some kind of test or initiation, and not just something bored people were doing to pass the time. They put real effort into stalking us, and ultimately were rewarded with a dog attack. I think they got lucky. Fortunately, I've never seen another trespasser on my property since.
Ask a cop which day of the year they dread working the most. 1 or 2 might answer Christmas or Super Bowl Sunday, and I get that. But 9 out of 10 will give you the same tired look before they utter one single word: Halloween. Halloween might just be some light-hearted spooky fun for some, but for law enforcement, it's no joke. The small New England town I serve in has a spike of about 6 or 7 times the number of emergency calls on Halloween night alone. It really does bring out the absolute worst in people. I mean, there's the stuff we anticipate every year: ungenerous houses having suffered a barrage of weaponized eggs, trees covered in toilet paper, homeowners complaining of juvenile trespassers. Those calls are manageable, but they bog down our on-duty officers so that when serious crimes happen, we're dangerously understrength. But all of the dumb Halloween mischief I've had to respond to over the years, all of it pales in comparison to what I found at the house on the end of Jefferson Street. That was a Halloween night I don't think I'll ever forget. I just responded to a call regarding a group of teenagers who had apparently been engaging in some pretty aggressive trick-or-treating, all without costumes. That type of stuff is exactly why I hate Halloween. No, what they were doing wasn't strictly illegal, but I can't exactly have a bunch of knuckle-draggers making trouble on a night like that, especially not with the hundreds of excited children roaming the streets. I lecture them. They roll their eyes, but I join the force to get into car chases with bad guys, not argue semantics with a bunch of stoned brats. They walk away, muttering stuff that I choose to ignore while I get back in my patrol car. The radio almost immediately buzzes to life. My dispatcher says something over the radio involving this rundown house over on Jefferson Street. I start the car up, listening as he describes a member of the public calling to report that the house has Halloween decorations that were too scary. She then says it's the second call that day and I should go over and check it out if I have a minute to spare. She always did have a sense of humor. She knew well I was off my feet. We had a little laugh about it. Like I said, we get some seriously ridiculous calls on Halloween. It's not just dumb kids. It's bitter old misers and party poopers who honestly just resent people having a good time. This one good Christian lady calls us every year over trespassing trick-or-treaters, on kids, who calls the cops on actual children. Anyway, I carry about my duties, responding to calls and generally keeping an eye out for trouble. A few hours slip by, the sun sets, the smaller kids, led by their parents, disappear back into their homes until it's just a few older groups on their way to parties and whatnot. Then, the dispatcher gets on to me about this house on Jefferson. She says she had 3 more calls about the decorations, how they're scaring kids and even some parents, and she needs me to roll over there to check it out. Great. Arguing with some slasher movie-obsessed hermit who's probably about to get all sovereign citizen on me, just what I need to make me feel like a guardian of the innocent. Sometimes I feel like the world's grumpy stepfather, honestly. So I take the ride over there, to this smaller part of town that's a little more run down, arriving on Jefferson. I see the house immediately. There was absolutely no missing it. The old colonial-looking place was covered in Halloween decorations. Cardboard standees of vampires and zombies, a ton of fake cobwebs all over the porch. I think I counted like 20 carved pumpkins dotted all over the lawn. Pretty intricate designs, too. But hanging from a large oak just to the side of the house was the most disturbing Halloween decoration I had ever seen. Not disturbing because it looked real. The limbs of the figure were too rigid, the hair a little too artificial, but the placement of the thing. It really did set me on edge as I stared out of the patrol car at it. The figure hung by a rope from one of the oak tree's long, thick branches, drifting gently in the fall breeze. Look, I'm a cop. I've seen some stuff. I don't frighten easily. I'm very logical, very level-headed, but that thing sent a shiver down my spine. I stepped out of the car, keeping my eyes glued to the hanging decoration as I walked towards it, the sound of crunching leaves under my feet with each and every step. Reaching for the flashlight on my belt, I pointed the torch beam over towards the tree. I could see why people had called this in. The texture on the thing's skin, it was very graphic, blotchy and purple, almost like an actual corpse. I only took another few steps before I felt extremely foolish for my previous thought. The smell, the sickly sweet smell of death hung in the air along with what I thought was just a cheeky decoration. It wasn't. It was an actual corpse that had been hanging there all day. Hundreds of kids must have walked past there, only a few of them actually recognizing that the thing hanging from the tree was a real cadaver. I felt sick. Sprinting back to my patrol car, I radioed into dispatch to get the coroner out to Jefferson Street as soon as possible. My dispatcher was absolutely horrified when she learned what I had, that other people had been staring at a dead body all day, many of them none the wiser. The hanged man was a one Richard Dodd, a retired teacher who was reported to have been caught up in some vigilante pedo sting. According to investigating officers, Mr. Dodd had been tricked into revealing questionable interest to individuals that were posing as an underage girl. When they threatened to go public with some of the more despicable things he said online, Mr. Dodd had opted for the easy way out, systematically fashioning a rope and doing the deed, all without a thought for who might happen across his body. People give me a hard time for not being into Halloween as a holiday, for rolling my eyes when grown adults talk about how wasted they're going to get or what costume they have picked out. But if they knew the things that went on around them on that grisly night, things that are sometimes hiding in plain sight, I don't think they'd be so quick to celebrate. We used to have this neighbor back when I was 15, and I didn't find this out until years later, but he basically was the sole reason we ended up moving out of the house we were living in at the time. So the way my dad tells it, it all started when the guy started making something in the shed in his backyard. Obviously, he was entitled to do whatever he wanted on his property, especially during the daylight hours, but my dad said all the sawing and hammering noises were a real pain in the butt. He figured it'd only be a couple of days, but a week went by and the guy was still making all this noise in the evenings and on weekends. It went on late into the night on a bunch of different occasions, and my dad had to go over and threaten to call the cops to get him to knock it off. Seems a little extreme, I know, but Dad had already tried asking nicely and the guy was just a total jerk, so it was the only thing that seemed to work. After that, the guy kept the sawing and hammering to reasonable hours. Still a pain apparently, but nothing he didn't have the right to. But then, my dad looks over the fence one day and sees the guy carrying a whole bunch of chains into the shed. Then the next thing he knows, the guy is carrying all these shackle-looking things into the shed, the kind you use to keep a person prisoner. Dad asks what he's building in there, but the guy is all, "Mind your business, mister," saying things like that. My dad is starting to get pretty nervous about the whole thing, and he's close to calling the cops because it was obviously looking incredibly shady, and maybe it'll get the guy to stop hammering and sawing all freaking day too. But still, he holds off for one night too long, and that's when he hears a scream coming from the guy's backyard. He says it was one of those screams of the blood-curdling variety, and he goes outside to listen, then hears a few more muffled sounds coming from the shed where the guy was building, whatever it was he was building in there. He tries looking over the fence to get an idea of what's going on and sees our neighbor walking out to the shed, covered in blood, with something sharp and shiny in his hand. But just before he closes the door, Dad said he caught a glimpse of someone strapped onto some kind of big wooden board. That was it. My dad runs back inside, calls the cops, and tells them something messed up is happening in our neighbor's backyard, how he had been building some kind of torture device or whatever, and how he thought he was in the process of basically murdering someone in there. The cops show up, but they don't make it into the backyard. They just drive off after talking to the guy. My dad calls the cops back and asks them what they're thinking, and they need to get into that shed right away because something unspeakable is happening in there. They tell them that they can't get into the guy's place without a warrant, that the guy had a bandaged hand and claimed the blood was because he had an accident. The cops seemed happy enough with that explanation and had gone back to their precinct. But they were in the process of getting a warrant because of my dad's claim that he'd seen a body in there, and because of how urgent it was, it might only be a few hours before they could get one signed by a judge. Then boom. The next day, the cops show back up at the guy's house at like 6 a.m., and it wakes my dad up because they were literally sawing a lock off the door to the shed. He watches all freaking morning, and get this, they carry out the body he'd seen in that shed. Only it wasn't a body. It was like one of those mannequin-type things, and it had blood all over it. The guy has actually been building some kind of torture table in his shed, only he hadn't actually done anything to anyone, so the guy ended up getting a full apology from the county after they didn't find anything to arrest him over. But still, my dad's not happy knowing he lives next to someone who'd build something like that, and after arguing back and forth with the cops about the guy's right to build some sort of weird torture table, he ends up just being like, "Screw this, we're moving." He didn't say anything to us at the time because obviously me and my sister were still young and he didn't want anything like that in our heads. But after I'd moved out and my sister had graduated college, he ended up telling us at a little reunion dinner. As you can guess, our jaws were on the floor when he was telling us, as we had no idea he was anything but some annoying home improvements nerd. It came up because we were complaining about having to move schools at that age, as me and my sister both lost a bunch of good friends, and it sucked having to start at a new school right when I just started at a new one there. He figured the whole thing would be justified to us why we had to move, and honestly, I get it. I wouldn't want to live next to a freak like that, either.
I typically don't really like attention, yet since freshman year I've got nothing but admirers. It wasn't quite the dream though. I tend to attract guys that I find, for lack of a better word, gross and dumb. They have no idea about boundaries or hygiene. The people who I did like seem to never feel the same. This one boy really stands out like a sore thumb because I had once told this story in a YouTube video. However, I was urged to delete it because of some of the information I said. This started when I was around 14 to early 15 years old. For some quick context, I'm autistic and I use a classroom called BMC. The classroom was made for kids who needed help with emotional issues, such as anger or depression. Now, I only ever went to this classroom when I needed a break from all of the kids in the hectic classrooms, or whenever I was agitated. I never really talked to anyone in the classroom other than the staff. There were always at least 2 or 3 teachers in there to make sure none of these kids went too crazy. Some were really chill, but a lot of them were really crazy and hyper. I, most of the time, just listened to music while working. Because of this, I was shut off from the craziness and kind of just in my own little world. One day though, one of these kids who we'll call Jack came out to my spot on the bus stop. I ride the special need bus because the regular ones are typically just a little too crazy or crowded for me. But the bus that I usually rode parked at the furthest end of the bus loop. So I normally just wait by the trees nearby while listening to music and singing. That's when who we'll call Jack then came up to me. I was kinda surprised. He said that he had a crush on me despite us never even talking prior to this point. That was one warning sign I ignored. The second was that he asked if I wanted to go to prom with him. He was a senior. What made it even worse was that when my bus finally showed, I gave him my number and told him bye. What he said back to me, well, made me want to vomit. He then said with no hesitations whatsoever, "I love you." I'm not kidding. The literal minute that I sit down on the bus, he then starts spamming me with texts. At one point I even muted his texts and they'd still blow up my phone. Eventually I told my parents and the BMC manager what he was doing to me. They told me that he was 18 and that what he was doing could be considered illegal. I immediately blocked him on every single platform I owned. I really thought that would be the end of it, but sadly not. He would occasionally try and talk to me yet again. At first, I tried to be nice about rejecting him, but by the 3rd or 4th time, I just grew sick of it. I told him that if he kept it up, I was going to tell my parents and they would go to the police. He finally left me alone for a long time after that. This entire experience really taught me to trust my gut because he was literally trying to date a 14-year-old girl. I really hope that this tells you that no matter what, it's always okay to listen to your gut. Otherwise, you could end up in a very scary or really uncomfortable scenario.
Last January, I was working as an associate at the Walmart over in Lake Charles. I was working second shift, so that's 1 p.m. to 10 p.m., and it was about 7 p.m. when people started to notice some kind of drama going off in the parking lot. The greeter noticed it first and was actually getting ready to have someone call the cops. But the whole thing seemed to die down, and then, from what I heard, things sort of just chilled out. I asked a coworker if anything juicy had happened, and she said no, but that the drama was between 2 groups of teenage girls and that one of the groups had walked into the store. They weren't being loud or obnoxious or anything, not at first anyway. They were just walking up and down the aisles talking among themselves, and one of the girls seemed to be making a video of them just hanging out. I remember hearing one of the girls saying something like, "Man, I need my taser back." But I just put that down to them talking smack after almost getting into a fight or something. The other thing I know is that loss prevention was watching them after one of them seemed to take something out of the kitchen utensils section, but they were just keeping their distance and observing until they tried to make an exit for the store. This is actually super relevant to what happened later on too, so keep it in mind. Anyways, I went back to what I was doing, and then the next thing I know, there's all kinds of screaming coming from near the front section of the store. I walked around to see what was going on, and that's when I see a group of girls in the doorway, shouting at the group that was inside. They were all saying all this stuff like, "Where y'all at? Come out." They knew the other group had walked inside the Walmart and were obviously trying to find them. The greeter was trying to get them to calm down or leave, saying they could either stop making a scene or was going to call the cops, but neither group was paying him any mind. Then, one of the girls in the doorway group starts saying something threatening, and the other is all like, "I'm about to come out as soon as my sister gets here." But the other girl didn't want to wait for that. She just walks inside the store and marches straight over to this girl with dyed blonde hair. I'm like, snap. This is about to go off right here. And honestly, just like that, the two girls start throwing hands at one another in that typical girl fight way, just flailing their hands at one another. Then the girl with blonde hair, she reaches for something in her pants, and although I didn't see it clearly, she swings at the other girl's chest, and it looks a lot like she just punched her. But then as soon as the hit connected, the blonde girl, backed up, then ran off while the other girl just sort of staggered back, then looked down at her chest. I didn't see the blood, not right away, I just heard the screams. What I did see was the girl who had been hit stagger a few steps, then just collapse on the floor. Then when her friends dropped down and rolled her over, that's when I saw the blood on the floor. The EMTs were called, the girl was taken away in an ambulance, and we were all basically tasked with comforting the girl's friends as they were absolutely all shooken up that they just watched their girl get stabbed. Then, about 9 p.m., because we had to empty the store out so the cops could do their thing, I was told I could finish early so I could go home and try and get the whole thing out of my head. But then, a half hour after I walked through the front door of my parents' place, I get an Instagram DM from one of the younger coworkers that I was tight with. They asked something like, "You were working second shift tonight, right?" And I respond, "Yeah, some messed up stuff happened." Then the next thing they send me is this long link that had Facebook in there somewhere. I figured it'd just be a sharing of a news story about the whole stabbing thing, but when I opened up the link, it opens up one of those Facebook Live videos, and instantly I knew what I was watching. I knew what I was watching because, 1, I recognized one of the girls from the stabbing at work, and 2, they're saying things like, "That was too much," and "If she killed her, she killed her," and then shrugging it off as if though it was her fault for coming at them and her friend was just defending herself. And then it got way worse. They were literally bragging how they killed someone, and they knew they killed someone too. I mean, I just thought the girl would be taken to the ER or something, but they knew she'd stabbed her in the heart because she aimed to stab her in the heart. We didn't find out until the next day that the girl who got stabbed had died on the way to the hospital. The most effed up thing though, none of those girls looked older than my little sister, who was a high school freshman at the time. Some of them barely looked like they'd gone through puberty yet. I mean, these were literally kids, literally effing children, and they just killed somebody and were proud of it. I think maybe it was just that they were trying to hide how scared they were, or trying to establish the whole self-defense thing before the cops came looking for them. But my God, seeing that kind of savagery coming out of a kid made my heart break for humanity a little. Those girls had ruined their lives with one little fight, and even worse, they'd literally ended another girl's. Taken her away from her family, friends, all she had going for her in life, all because of one stupid fight.
In high school, when I was a junior, I took a psychology class. It was my second period of the day. I liked the class, and one of the best things about it was that we were able to take open book tests. The teacher was really chill and let us work together on stuff, including the tests. We also had an option to take the tests in study rooms, which I always did, because it was much more quiet and I just felt more comfortable in there. I was the only person in the class who did this still, because you needed a pass and the study rooms were all the way in the basement of the school. I guess most students just found that a hassle and would rather work with each other as well. Anyways, one particular Friday, when we had a test to take, I did the usual thing, which was to get the test from the teacher and then go down to the study room. It took me about 5 minutes to get down there. There wasn't a whole lot at all on that level of the school. Pretty much just the study rooms and then a couple of storage rooms and some old classrooms that weren't used. I got into one of the rooms and turned on the light. The rooms had carpet floors with a table and a few chairs in each one. They also had a little window for looking out into the hallway. I began the test and searched through my psychology book for the answers. I remember I had just reached question 15 when I suddenly heard over the intercom that we were entering a lockdown. I got a little nervous, but I told myself it was probably nothing. I turned the lights off like we were instructed to, but I didn't see a lock on the door. Our school was kind of old and these study rooms were sort of outdated. I went under the desk and decided to play some games on my phone to pass the time. Several minutes went by without anything happening. Then I heard some footsteps coming down the hallway. I got really nervous knowing the footsteps likely belonged to someone that wasn't supposed to be in the school. I turned my phone off and I got really quiet. The footsteps went down towards the door of my study room. As I hid under the table, I slowly turned my head to look towards the window, and just as I did, I saw a man walk past it. All I could tell is that he was wearing a hooded sweatshirt, really. He walked past without looking in the window, but it still scared me a lot. Then I heard the door open in the room across the hall from mine, and then it shut. He must have gone in it, and at that point, I was seriously considering making a run for it. I was relatively fast, but I didn't know who this guy was. I was trying to psych myself up into running when I heard the door open once again and then shut. I buried my face into the ground and held my breath. I didn't really hear any footsteps though, so I lifted my head slightly to listen. I didn't know whether he had walked away or if he was just standing there. This made it much more risky for me to try to run away, so I decided to stay put for the time. Several minutes went by and I got more and more nervous. I decided once again I was going to try to run back upstairs, and this time I was going to actually do it. I didn't bother getting my backpack or anything, besides just my phone, wallet, and keys. I slowly crawled up the carpet to the door, and then stood up, careful not to make a sound. I then placed my hands on the doorknob. The second it started to turn, I heard it creak, and it sounded extremely loud. At that moment, I knew there was no turning back. I quickly left the room, and then headed down the hallways. Once I saw it was clear, I started sprinting towards the stairs, which were about 50 feet away. As I was running, I looked down one hallway to my right while passing by, and saw the man walking out of a room about 20 feet down the hallway. I ran even faster the rest of the ways and didn't look back. I sprinted up the stairs all the way back to my classroom. Once I got there, I pounded on the door yelling that it was me, and after about 10 seconds, I was let in. I told the teacher what had happened, and she alerted the principal. Police were able to get into the basement and locate the man, who was later found hiding in the same study room I had been in. Apparently, the man had broken into the school and beat up one of the teachers, then ran off. They had been searching the school, but hadn't made it to the basement yet. Every time I went near the basement of the school for the rest of my high school career, I would think about that day.
Okay, so little side note here. Has anyone else noticed how nice the weather has gotten since the lockdown started? God, it's been so frustrating. Shut indoors while the weather went from gray and windy to warm and sunny like, well, must have been a matter of days. In all my life, I've honestly never seen spring slam into winter with such a dramatic transition. It's been tough on my little girl, too. She's been dying to get out to the local park to play on the jungle gyms, and telling her no, not to mention explaining why, has been harder and harder as the weeks have gone by. I can't tell her the truth because I knew it would absolutely terrify her. Breaking down, there are little creatures living inside of us, waiting to be transmitted to someone she loves like Pap or Nana, which could end their lives. How do you even say that to a child without them totally freaking out? So, our story starts with bird watching. I know, boring, but try telling that to my daughter. She burned through all her DVDs and favorite YouTube channels in like a week, and despite some of them having palpable rewatch value to them, she quickly grew tired of staring at a screen for hours on end. It got way worse, and we started having to tell her no about going to the park. Seems like once you hold something out of reach of the kid, it's all they want from then on, the forbidden thing. I found a happy compromise with her, in that if she stayed inside, she could look at the garden all she wanted. And the bonus was that if she stayed super still and quiet, that all kinds of birds and other critters would wander into the garden for her to look at. And you know what? It actually got kind of fun after a while. I actually fished out an old native birds of the upper American East Coast that I'm pretty sure was my grandpa's at one point, and we got to work ticking off each one we saw, working our way through the book as common and rarely seen birds alike landed among the flower beds of our backyard. One evening I'd swear I saw something larger moving around the trees at the back of our yard, but I figured it was just a trick of the light. Maybe a neighbor's dog moving against their back fence, casting shadows into ours. But a few days later, I discovered it wasn't just my imagination. I was doing some laundry upstairs while my daughter busied herself with birdwatching. I'd ordered a cheap pair of kids' binoculars from Amazon, and those things really had paid for themselves by the evening of the day they arrived. My kid was obsessed with them. She had them practically strapped to her face for the entire day, looking at everything and anything up close and being amazed at the results. So she was only happy to sit in front of the patio window doors and while away the hours by checking out the wildlife at close range through her new binos. And thank God, because having to keep an eye on her day in and day out was meaning housework was mounting up, and at the top of the list was laundry. So I'm working through piles of dirty clothes, calling down to her every so often to see how she was doing, and everything seems to be going fine. Every so often I'd rush down when she claimed to have spotted a new kind of bird in our garden. Often I'd have to point out that it was one we'd seen before, but once or twice we actually locked eyes with a lesser spotted woodpecker, a bird we most definitely hadn't spotted before. Only when I heard her cry out, "Kitty," I figured she must have gotten kind of bored of watching for birds. At first I was a little worried. The last thing I wanted was for my little girl to witness a full-on bird murder in our own backyard, but I was quietly reassured by the fact that all the neighborhood cats were fat and spoiled, and they wouldn't be finessing at backyard birds anytime soon. That was for certain. Suddenly I heard a kind of thump against the window doors, like my daughter had hit her hand against the glass super hard. I called down to tell her not to hit the glass, as it would scare all the birds away and they might not come back to visit. Her answer made me drop the laundry basket and hurtle downstairs. "I didn't. It was the kitty." But that thump was loud, bigger and louder than anything a simple house cat could make. It was so weird to write back now, but I distinctly remember just not thinking at all, just sort of flying into action, this white-hot urge to protect, just turning me into more machine than woman. And what do I see the moment I turn the corner into the living room? I see my daughter, standing at the glass doors, staring at an actual mountain lion in the face. The huge cat had its paw half cocked, as if I didn't already have an idea that it was the one making that banging noise against the glass. I ran toward my little girl with such speed and aggression that the mountain lion jumped back for a second. The inherent danger of the situation, danger that she seemed to be completely unaware of previously, caught up with her and hit her like a freight train. She started bawling, screaming, realizing in a white-hot moment that Kitty didn't want to play. Kitty wanted to rip and tear. That the kitty wasn't a kitty at all. Once it realized I'd taken away its intended prey, the mountain lion took a few more swipes at the glass and only rushed out the backyard once I started banging pots and pans together real loud, just like my grandpa had showed me years before. I guess this was just a long-winded way of saying to keep a real close eye on the woods and green spaces when this lockdown is over, It might not be entirely safe for our kids to be playing in places that have obviously been reclaimed by wildlife, and dangerous wildlife at that.
I was an 18-year-old female when this incident occurred. I was in the first year of university. I was walking to one of my classes when I then saw a man walking towards me. There was nothing really too off-putting about his appearance. He was tall and slightly large, and he looked to be in his 40s. He was also wearing a shirt with my school's logo on it, the same shirt that the service workers wore. I noticed that he was staring at me. I stared back at him to try and make him look away, but he didn't. He continued to walk towards me and held eye contact till he passed me. I didn't really think too much of this. Over the next few months, I had saw him around campus several times, and the same thing would always happen. He would always stare at me until he walked past me, but he never once said a word. On one occasion, I had saw him in the basement of my building while I was doing laundry. Once again, he walked past me without saying anything. Although he really made me feel a bit uneasy, I didn't let it bother me too much, and just kind of assumed that maybe he just had something off about him. This continued for a couple of months before anything disturbing happened. On one night, my roommate was asleep and I needed to clear my head, so I slipped on my shoes and coat and then headed out for a smoke. Now, my university's campus was smoke-free, so I walked around to the back of my building and then lit a cigarette. I had heard some rustling coming from further away, still around the building but kind of in a spot where I couldn't see it. I didn't get too worried though, as the back of my building faced the woods and we're kind of used to seeing deer and other small animals around the campus. Still though, I was really curious. I quietly walked over and looked around the corner. I was surprised to see a man standing there looking right up at my building. I started to squint my eyes and that's when I realized that it was the same man who was always staring at me. What was he doing? His hands were in his pockets and he seemed to just be staring right up at the windows. I felt a little uneasy as that's when I realized that he was staring at the general area of my own window, but I couldn't tell for sure what he was looking at. I didn't want him to see me, so I quietly finished my cigarette and flicked it onto the ground. I crushed the cigarette into the ground with my shoe and then headed back to my room. I had then took a really quick shower and slipped on some PJs. I tried to fall asleep that night, but I just couldn't get that man out of my head. Why was he just staring at the building? Was he really looking into my window? After a few minutes of wrestling with my thoughts, I decided that my questions really needed answers. So I quietly got up and tiptoed across my room to the window. I looked out the window, and sure enough, the man was staring at me. When he noticed me staring back, I honestly expected him to walk away. But he didn't. He just continued to stare at me. I started to feel kind of sick at this point. Should I call someone? I mean, I guess he wasn't technically doing anything wrong, so I decided I would just leave it. He couldn't do anything to harm me. My door was always kept locked, and there was no way he could fit through my window. It was on the 3rd floor, and it was extremely tiny. I crawled back into bed and went to sleep. About 2 months had passed since this incident, and I hadn't seen the man since. I was hoping that maybe he had quit or maybe he had been fired, but I wasn't so lucky. One day I came back from class to then find my roommate standing in the lobby of my building, and she had 2 police officers standing with her. When she saw me, she had then grasped and ran right towards me, then hugging me. She was visibly really shaken and she seemed really scared about something. I asked her what was going on, and before she could even answer me, a police officer then approached me. He then asked me to confirm my name and room number. I told him, and he then showed me a picture of the man. It was the same exact man that had been standing out my building 2 months prior. I said that I recognized him, and I told them everything that happened from the start of the year. The police officer sat me down, and he then told me what happened. Apparently the man had been sneaking into our room like multiple times throughout the year. The man had both mine and my roommate's schedule so that he could see when we would be in and out of the room. He also had placed micro cameras in the corners of the room. My roommate wasn't feeling well, so when she had left one of her classes early one day, she had returned to the room to find the man standing in it. She then freaked out and called the campus police. The police then searched his office and they found that he had stolen multiple things from my room. Things like my underwear, and he even stole my garbage. It was really weird. He also had like dozens of pictures of me, and some even taken around campus, and some extremely zoomed in on me in my room. The man also had a spare key to our room, which he would use to get in and out of it. The man was obviously fired from his job. I'm not exactly sure what kind of legal action was taken, but the police assured me that I'd never see him again. I've always really wondered what his true intentions were, and what would have happened if my roommate hadn't caught him that day. I guess it's a good thing I never found out.
This is an experience my wife and I just had this past year. As soon as the quarantine was lifted in our area, she and I filled our packs and went for a hike at our local state park. It was something we used to do pretty regularly and have since before we got married. Speaking for myself, I was really looking forward to it. The plan was to hike out to a certain lake, spend the night, and hike back to the car. It was a clear, warm day and the trails were nice and dry. For most of that morning, we had been the only people on the trail. We decided to stop for lunch at a campsite about halfway to the lake. Another couple must have had the same idea. They were sitting at the concrete picnic table and we asked to join them. Soon, the four of us were discussing what we had seen and where we were headed. The couple turned out to be newlyweds on their honeymoon. My wife, who's a hopeless romantic, loved to hear this. She proceeded to tell them how we'd met and some other sappy stuff I don't bother to remember. 2 hours passed and we finally said our goodbyes. We arrived at the lake about an hour before dark, tired and hungry. I got a fire started and Mandy, my wife, cooked us a small meal while I pitched the tent. We sat around the fire cooking s'mores and eventually called it a night at around 10 p.m. I got up just before dawn the next morning and got the fire ready to make the breakfast. We repeated our roles from the night prior, except I pulled the tent down and repacked it. All the measures were taken to ensure the fire was completely out after cooking, and with that, we took to the trail for the return journey. At 10 a.m., we reached the halfway point, but chose not to stop. 2 hours up the trail, we ran into the husband of the couple we'd met the day before. Strangely, his wife wasn't with him. Mandy asked him about her location, and the man said that she'd become ill the night before and returned home. When he said it, he looked nervous and couldn't look either of us in the eyes. Before either of us could ask anything else, he said that his wife had insisted he finish the trip alone. It sounded a bit strange, but we had no reason not to believe him. A group of people came walking up about that same time, and the husband excused himself to talk to them. I wasn't interested in prying any further. Their marriage was none of my business, I thought. Mandy looked like she wanted to stay, but I reminded her of the obligations we had that night. She reluctantly agreed and we went on our way. We got to the parking lot not too long after and packed up our stuff. There were a few groups of people talking amongst themselves. As we pulled out of the lot, several more cars, including a ranger's truck, were pulling in. Once again, I thought nothing of it. We made it back home that afternoon and handled some family things. It wasn't until breakfast that we heard the news. I had grabbed a cup of coffee and sat down in front of the TV. I flipped it on just in time to receive a report of a dead female camper. When they showed her face on the screen, I almost choked on my coffee. It was a picture of the woman we had met just 2 days prior. I yelled out to Mandy to join me in the living room. I wanted to be sure of what I was seeing. I didn't have my glasses on at the time, and I pointed at the TV and asked, "Isn't that one of the newlyweds we met at the park?" She watched for a moment and let out a shocked gasp. Just then, a wedding photo of the couple appeared on the screen. Mandy grabbed the remote from my hand and turned up the volume. According to the husband, the couple had been at a cliffside that was a popular lookout. Mandy and I had been there once or twice ourselves in the past. They had watched the sun rise, and as they were preparing to turn and leave, the wife lost her footing and fell several hundred feet to the ground below. It was certainly possible, but something bothered me about it. Why hadn't he mentioned this to us? More so, what was up with the illness story? It couldn't have been more than a few hours after the incident had occurred. None of his behavior made any sense. I know if something such as that happened to me, I'd have been a mess. We had passed at least 15 people that morning and not a soul talked to us. It all seemed fishy to me. I was glad to see that Mandy agreed with me. It looked as if though her instincts had been right once again. Just don't tell her I said that. After a long discussion about our responsibilities and the like, we agreed that we should contact the law enforcement involved in the case. And as it stood, the husband isn't under any suspicion. Not publicly, anyways. I contacted the sheriff's office and told them what we knew. The deputy put us on hold for a moment, and when he returned, he said someone may reach out to us in the future. But it's been almost a year and no one has contacted us. And this is what brings me to emailing you here. What do you think? My instincts and my wife's tell us that a crime may have occurred. We, however, have no proof or any real justification for our feelings. And that's just what they are, feelings. Certainly if law enforcement believed we had something to offer, they would have already contacted us, right? I don't want to be a nuisance, nor do I want to cause trouble for a grieving man who by all appearances is a decent person. But help me out here. Should I keep pushing or leave the police to do their jobs? I just can't shake this nagging feeling that a man is getting away with cold-blooded murder.
Working as a driver for DoorDash has been a pretty good side job ever since I moved to Converse, Texas. I mainly pick up deliveries inside of San Antonio, but sometimes I will find ones that take me out of Converse and a bit into the country. Now, I used to not mind those deliveries, and I would pretty much accept any job that I could handle, but after this one incident that brought me to a Texas ranch, I will no longer go outside of the cities of Converse and San Antonio. It was around 8:30 p.m., and I picked up an order that brought me out to the middle of nowhere. That's the crazy thing about Texas. 1 second, you can be in a big city, and the next, there is practically nothing around you for miles. As I drove around looking for the entryway onto this massive property, I began following a large fence that ran alongside the street. I figured the fence would eventually lead me to the entryway, and I was correct. I pulled into a small driveway that led me to a large electric gate with a number pad that required a code to get in. I wasn't given a code, so I decided to contact the person who sent out the order. They responded within a minute with a text that read, the code, pound 6660. Welcome to the family. I was confused by that last line, but I leaned out of my car window and punched in the code, chuckling to myself at the fact that they used 666 for a code. After a second, the gate made a loud banging sound and then slowly slid open across rust-covered tracks. The gate opened to reveal a long, winding pathway with trees lining both sides of it. They must have been planted there by the owners a while back because they looked oddly out of place compared to the barren fields that surrounded the ranch. I began to make my way down the driveway, and I couldn't help but shake the creepy feeling that was coming over me. I was on edge, which I'm glad for because as I rounded one of the small bends, in the middle of the driveway my headlights revealed a tall, pale man wearing a dirt-covered black suit. We stared at each other for a moment without either of us moving. I was in shock. Eventually, I got the courage to roll my window down a bit and yell out, "Did you order the takeout?" But he didn't answer. All he did was step to the side and point down the driveway, as if telling me to continue. Reluctantly, I did. I continued down the pathway, and behind every couple of trees, I can't help but think that I see more people dressed up in a similar suit as the man who had been standing in the driveway. Still, I continued on. Finally, I could see a house in front of me, but as if it was something out of my worst nightmare. Standing on the porch of the large house and along the outside of the driveway were at least a dozen or more men, all dressed in dirt-covered suits, some black and some gray. I froze. I didn't know what to do, but I knew for a fact that nothing could make me get out of my car at that moment. After sitting in the driveway, staring at the group of strange men, I noticed that one of them had something in their hand. My eyes widened as I realized what it was, and I quickly threw the car into reverse. One of the men on the porch was carrying a rifle of sort. I wasn't close enough to see what kind it was, but I knew it was a firearm of some sort. I slammed my foot on the gas and began swinging my car around in reverse to turn around so that I could drive out of there as fast as I could. At that point, I noticed a few of the men now begun walking toward my car. After fully turning around, I put my car into drive and began flooring it. I let out a scream as I heard a loud bang followed by my rear windshield shattering. I leaned forward and made my head as low as possible while still being able to see over the dashboard. As I made my way down the driveway, every tree that I passed, I could see a man stepping out from behind it and walking toward the path that I had been driving down. Luckily, none of them seemed to be armed. I made it out of the driveway and onto the road, and as I passed the still open gate, I noticed that it began to close. They were trying to trap me inside with them. I sped down the road and called 911 as I made my way to the police station and explained to them what just happened to me. They were confused when I told them the address because they were familiar with it, and it had apparently been an abandoned property for the past decade. By the time the officers made it to the ranch, however, they said it appeared to still be abandoned and there was no one around. 3 hours after I finally got home, around 2:30 a.m., I received a text message saying, "Where'd you go? It was just getting fun." That was the last time I ever took an order outside of the city.
I think I was only 13 years old.
I started working for DoorDash shortly before the pandemic hit, about 2.5 years ago, and at first I loved it. I was fresh out of high school and earning a decent amount of money making deliveries throughout Brooklyn and the surrounding boroughs. The best part of the job was being able to set my own hours, and since I had nothing better to do, I just worked as much as I could and earned as much as I could while it was possible. The only reason I stopped was that I lost my car and couldn't afford to get a new one without getting a different, less mobile job. You see, I was doing my usual routine and waiting for an order to be placed that I could pick up and make a couple of dollars. And when an order finally came through, I was quick to snatch it and begin making my way to the pickup location. It was a pizza place that I was familiar with, so finding parking to pick up the food wasn't an issue at all. And by the time it was ready to be picked up, I was there grabbing it. I made my way back to my car as fast as I could, letting the person who ordered the pizza know that their food was picked up and on the way. I looked at my phone and saw that the delivery was to an apartment building a couple blocks over, and in no time, I was en route with the food. It took me about 6 minutes to get to the block that the apartment building was located on, and luckily for me, street parking wasn't too bad at that time of day, and I managed to find a spot that was right next to the building. Now this was a no-contact delivery, which meant that I was to leave the food at the door, take a picture of it, notify the person who ordered the food that their pizza was downstairs, and then they were responsible for coming to get it. So I walked up to the door and placed the food in a safe spot, and as I was taking my phone out of my pocket, I noticed a group of young men who looked to be no older than 16 down on the corner. I couldn't help but notice they all kept looking over at me. Now in my mind, I figured that they were just thinking about trying to take the food, so I wasn't concerned for my safety at all, and I continued about my business. I took my phone out and began taking a picture of the food, and then I even called the number that I was given for the person who ordered the food to let them know that their food was downstairs. I didn't want them to miss out on any of the delicious pizza. As I hung up the phone, I took another look down the corner of the block, and this time I saw the entire group had been staring my way. I'm not sure why, but this made me feel really uneasy, and I figured that it was time for me to go. As I went to turn toward my car, out of my peripheral vision, I could see the group had started moving. They were heading toward me, Again though, in my head, these kids just wanted the food, so I tried not to freak out and continued heading to my car. That was when I heard it. One of the young men yelled out to me, "Hey mister." I tried to ignore it, but then I heard it again. "Hey mister, hang on a minute." To this day, I'm not sure why, but I stopped in my tracks and turned to face the group that was trying to get my attention. As I turned though, I quickly learned what their intentions were. As soon as I was facing them, I heard 3 sounds that almost sounded like small fireworks popping off. And at the same time, I saw 3 muzzle flashes from a small handgun that one of the teenagers was carrying. I didn't feel anything at first, but when my leg buckled underneath me, I looked down and knew right away that I had been hit. I fell to the floor and the pain began to kick in. I screamed out for help, thinking that surely I was about to be killed for some unknown reason. I was somewhat thankful, however, when the group ran past me and straight to my car, which still had the keys inside. I heard the sound of people around me screaming as the car pulled off. The person who had ordered the food had come outside by that point, and they were the ones who called the ambulance for me. I never got that car back, but thankfully, I was still able to walk after all was said and done, and I definitely learned a lesson about being aware of my surroundings.
When I was a senior in high school, I worked as a pizza delivery boy. It was a pretty good paying job with tips, and I enjoyed it a lot. One night on a Friday, I was working and got a delivery for 1 pizza to a house on the other end of town. I made the drive to the house, which took about 10 minutes, and then I arrived. I stepped out of the car and started to walk up to the house. It was a small and average-looking house, kind of old, nothing eye-catching. I walked to the front door, but when I got there, I noticed a post-it note stuck to the door that said to use the back. I walked around to the back door of the house, which was located in the center of the house in front of a small fenced backyard with a little patio on it. I was about to knock on the door when I saw another post-it note. It said, "Please bring pizza inside." Now this made me a little bit uncomfortable, but I decided to go in anyways. I could hear music playing from inside the house. When I opened the door, I saw what appeared to be a kitchen. It was pretty empty though. There was no food or plates out, but on the kitchen table near the door, there was a Bluetooth speaker that was playing music. I started to place the pizza box on the table, and I saw yet another sticky note posted there. It said, "Bring pizza downstairs and I will give you your tip." I looked to the end of the kitchen and saw an open doorway with a staircase leading to a very dark basement. This is where I had to draw the line in my head. I decided I would have to skip the tip on this one, and I was not going to go down the stairs. I left the pizza on the table and started to walk away to leave. But then, the music on the speaker stopped playing, and a deep man's voice started speaking on it and said, "Stop." Then it said, "Why don't you come downstairs?" I wasn't going to stay there any longer, and I quickly opened the door and left. When I did, I could hear the deep man's voice laughing. I ran back to my car and drove all the way back to the restaurant. A few weeks later, when I was working, I got a delivery, and when I started driving, I noticed it was the address of that creepy house again. I really did not want to go back there, but it was my job, and I didn't want to tell my boss I was scared, so I continued driving. Once I arrived, I took a good look at the house. I could see a note was on the door again. I sat in my car for a good minute, hyping myself up to go back to the house. I finally got out and started walking straight to the back, but when I noticed the front door, the sticky note said something different on it this time. I walked up to the front door and looked closer. The note said, "Come in the front door this time," and then it had a smiling, winking face on it. I just dropped the pizza on the front step and knocked on the door 2 times and then left. I hurried back to my car, got in, and drove back to the restaurant again. Thankfully, I never had to deliver to that house again. occurred several years ago. I used to shop at Walmarts quite frequently. They really sold everything I needed and were all over the place, so it was always my first store to go to. At one point, I had to go out of town for a work conference. It lasted about a week and was about a 10-hour drive away. After it was over, I was driving back. I was on the way home about halfway, and it got pretty late at night. I was prepared to drive through the night, but my car got low on gas, so I stopped at the next exit and filled it up. I was pretty hungry, but noticed that the convenience store of the gas station was closed. This town was really small and didn't seem to have much, but they did have a Walmart that was across the street. This Walmart was one of the strangest ones I had ever seen. It just wasn't the typical kind of Walmart building that they usually are in. The building seemed smaller, and more as if it had taken over a building of a previous store that had been there. The parking lot was quiet, only a couple of cars, so I looked it up on Google Maps, and it said sure enough it was open. This seemed kind of surprising to me because it was around midnight, but I pulled my car into the parking lot and went inside. As I slowly walked in, I didn't really know what I was looking for, but I guess just some type of food. As I walked around inside, I didn't notice anybody else. The inside of the Walmart looked for the most part like a regular Walmart, but at the same time, a lot different. It was much smaller inside and arranged differently than most of the ones I had been in. Still, not a big deal though, and I tried to find something I could snack on. As I walked around, I didn't see anybody else in the store at all. It seemed a little bit odd to not even see a worker, but then again it was midnight in a small town that I had never been in before. I had made it to the back aisle and was looking around when I heard the noise of someone walking. They entered the aisle from the far side from where I was in, and I noticed it was someone wearing one of those horse face masks that covers a person's whole head. I looked and it startled me at first, but then I chuckled. I guess it was some guy pranking people late at night. He stood there looking at me. Then he walked away. I told him it was very funny. I finally found a couple of things and picked them up. Then I headed to the front of the store. As I did, I noticed another person walking by, also wearing a horse mask. I thought maybe it had to be the guy's friend and they were both in on the joke. I once again smiled and kept walking. I used the self-checkout and paid for my things, all while not seeing a single employee. As I was almost done, I saw another two people emerge from behind one of the check lanes. They were both wearing horse masks as well. By that time, I got a rush of fear run through my body. I didn't know what was going on, but it didn't really seem like a joke to me anymore. I looked back and saw the other two people in horse masks staring at me from the back near the aisles. I tried to not let them see the fear that I had. I calmly got my receipt and walked away and out the doors. I walked all the way back to my car, hoping that I wouldn't hear the footsteps of anyone leaving behind me, and to my surprise, I didn't. But when I got to my car, I realized there was a new car that was parked next to mine. I tried to ignore it as best as I could, and got to my car, unlocked it, and quickly got inside. As I did, I glanced over to the car parked next to mine. At first, it looked like it was empty, but then I saw a horse mask pop up in the driver's seat. I just about had a heart attack in that moment. I slammed my foot on the gas and left that city back to the freeway and on my way home. I got home the next day and still wonder what was going on there.
So a few years ago, I used to work at the Waffle House in a college town, so weird people aren't really that unusual. To start off, there are only two 24-hour restaurants there, and I used to work third shift at the Waffle House. Sometimes, when a person's car would break down, the police would drop them off at one of these two places. They weren't supposed to, so they would drop them off within walking distance, but not actually outside, like some shitty loophole. So one night I was working with a cook and another waitress. We'll call them Mark and Cassie. Around 11 p.m., this old guy wanders into the lobby with a little bag. First off, we usually don't get older people after around 8 or so at the latest. Second off, this dude is creepy as fuck. He starts off with telling us about how his car broke down on the highway, and the police dropped him off in the parking lot next door. I felt bad for him because it's the middle of the night, and he's not from around here, and he has no money. so I pour him some coffee free of charge. My coworkers are usually on drugs, so I assume free coffee isn't going to get me fired. This is when the guy just starts talking my ear off. I can barely get in a word edgewise, which is difficult since I'm usually the talker. He talks about what happened to him, and then starts trying to sell the tools he has with him in his bag. Of course we say no, but he just keeps asking about it. He also starts wandering in and out of the store. The first time he does, Mark, who's ex-military, searches his bag to make sure he doesn't have any weapons, because he's starting to raise some eyebrows. There was nothing but tools, so we start to feel a bit safer. When he comes back in, I keep talking to him. Mark and Cassie note the fuck away to the other side of the store and watch. Keep in mind, this guy is literally the only person here. We don't start getting people until 1:30, when everyone leaves the bars. Now he's starting to talk about a lot of weird things. I tell him I'm interested in studying prisons, and he tells me the best way to do so is to get arrested. He then starts talking about how he used to be in prison, but he never says why. He starts to make us really nervous, so I start to draw him in case the dude decides to murder us. We'll have something because I'm good at drawing things I can see. There's a low little wall where we usually write out customer receipts, so I can draw him without him noticing. Not that that matters since he's looking straight ahead while he talks to me. We start getting customers because it's about 1 a.m. The bars let out at 1, so anyone who drives gets there shortly after, while those who walk get there about 30 minutes later. And this guy keeps talking no matter where I am. He doesn't raise his voice or anything. He just keeps talking at the same level, even when I walk away to take care of other customers. At this point, I'm starting to think this guy is schizophrenic. I'm a psych major, so I mean actual schizophrenia, and not just crazy. And at this point, wanting to get away, but I really can't because I'm afraid he might do something. He does, but not what I was afraid of. He starts just insulting customers. He tells one kid that he's fat, and starts asking him why he's so fat, and tells him he needs to lose weight. He then talks to a family of travelers and says,
"Your wife and kids are fine, but why are you so ugly?"
We decide he has to go. Mark tells him he has to leave, as we've warned him several times to leave the other customers alone. So Mark tells him to leave, or we're going to call the cops. The guy starts yelling at us, and glares at me, and asks why he should leave, but he finally just does after a while. But he comes back at half an hour later, and we have to kick him out again for harassing customers. He doesn't come back that night, so we decide he must have found a way home or contacted someone. So I finish around 7 a.m. and walk home. I live above the bars downtown, so it's a 30-minute walk, but along the way, I see the old guy. I dart behind a building and take the long way home. I don't think much of it because it's a small town and there's not a lot of places to go. I have to work again the next day, so I go home, sleep, get all my chores done, being an adult as usual. So about an hour before work, Waffle House calls me, and my coworker Kevin tells me the same old guy has been coming around several times during the day, every couple of hours looking for me. I'm a 23-year-old female, so they're worried about what he wants. I call my friend Jason and tell him why I need a ride, and he brings me in. I ask what's been going on, and apparently this guy has been in at least 10 times asking to talk to me. He never says why, so I'm on edge, waiting because I have no idea what this guy wants. Is this a 60-year-old guy pissed off because I didn't defend him when he was kicked out? Is he asking because I told him my name? Or is it something else? Surprisingly, for the first few hours of my shift, we didn't see him, but he eventually comes in and ignores me. I'm super confused, but I keep an eye on him again. I've also brought pepper spray. Before long though, we kick him out again for harassing customers. This is all very confusing for me. He's been asking for me all day and then ignores me when he comes in. But after we kick him out, he does not come back. When my shift ends, my friend asked me if I need a ride home. I tell him no. This guy has left and hasn't come back, so I'm good. Well, that's what I thought, until I saw him walking towards me after work. He yells out for me, and starts coming at me, but I run inside a building that I know has another exit. I sneak out the other way before this guy can find me, and thanking every god I can think of that I know the small town better than him. I still have no idea what he wants, but I'm not taking any chances. I sneak home through some back ways. I call work and let them know what happened, and asked for the next few days off. They agree, and later tell me the old guy kept coming in for the next few days, and they finally called the police, and they took him away.
Subway Spooks. Submitted by Michael T. Back when I was just out of college, me and a friend of mine, let's call him James, decided to eat at a Subway. After all, it wasn't far from James' little apartment he lived at. When we arrived, I could already feel this weird vibe of the place. This was a little normal, since James lives in a poor, run-down part of the city, so I normally felt like this when I drived around this area. Well, we went inside the Subway and it was pretty normal. I ended up getting a tuna and James got a steak and cheese. And all of a sudden, this guy walks in. He was really pale and skinny and was wearing a dirty wife beater with ripped track pants. He was balding and looked to be around 40 or 50 years old. He came up to the man working behind the counter, then just stood there staring right at him, doing literally nothing, just staring. Me and James were a little freaked out about this, and we felt a little bad for the guy working behind the counter, but we tried to ignore him while we ate our sandwiches. It was none of our businesses at the time. Around 1 minute later, the men working the counter decided to try and get the man out, since the guy was obviously not there for an order. Besides, the place didn't have much of security, no guards or cameras, so someone this sketchy could have been a liability. The guy came around the side when the creepy man suddenly ran out of the store. I mean, he bolted. But as he ran out, he passed us, and he locked eyes with me. It gave me a very nervous feeling. I just wanted to blend in with the background and enjoy my sandwich. But there this weird guy was, making a scene and looking right at me as he ran past and exited the store. He managed to get out of the store without a hassle. Though he looked at me as he exited, he never even looked in front of him, yet he didn't trip or run into anything. This guy was some kind of freak. 5 minutes later, we heard a car alarm go off really nearby, and maybe 10 seconds later, I realized what was happening. I saw lights coming from the window exactly where I parked my car. It wasn't that great of a car, but it's all I could afford at the time. So I ran out of the store along with James, and we were honestly about to beat the crap out of the person who was trying to break in our car. But when we got outside, nobody was there at my car. So we decided to call it a night before anything else crazy happened. We hopped in my car, not even finishing our food. We didn't even want to at that point, and we were about to drive off. But the moment the car started and the headlights turned on, we saw him. The creepy guy from the Subway was in front of our car now. I had no idea where he'd been hiding before, but I swear to God we didn't see him. He was about to jump on the hood of my car. He must have been some junkie or something, since he didn't jump until we backed out. We sped off on the way to James's place until he said he didn't want to go home. He lived too close to the Subway, and the last thing he wanted was that guy to see where he lives. I couldn't say I blamed James. I think I would have done the same thing, but it was weird coming from James because he was the bravest person I knew. So I told him that he could stay at my place, then we went home. Honestly, that was the last I saw of this creepy Subway guy. I don't know what was wrong with him, and I've never seen him again. But probably because of him, I'll never be going back to Subway. At least, not that one.
Back in my mid to late 20s, I worked a job as a security guard at a Kmart Supercenter in Iowa City, Iowa. Most of you probably never heard of Kmart before, but to put it in simple terms, just imagine a cheaper Walmart/Target. Business was booming back in the early 2000s, and nowadays a lot of Kmarts ended up closing down. My job was to keep watch of one that was currently in the process of relocating. It was a chill job, although a bit boring, as you'd be the only one in the store with nothing to do. This never really bothered me, as I'd always find myself playing games on my phone or texting a friend to pass time. Well, one day I had been scheduled to work a double, meaning I'd be working both the day and night shift. The reason for this was because the other security guard who did the night shifts quit on the spot and went to go make a living in real estate. Because apparently this guy's obviously never heard of a 2 weeks notice before, and they scheduled me until they could find another person. This got on my nerves pretty easily, and sitting in the dark making $14 an hour didn't help. That being said, I really didn't have a choice and bit my lip and agreed to work a double. Throughout the day, things went well for the most part, watching the movers relocate the shelves, equipment, etc. 7 p.m. comes around and I prepare myself for a long 10-hour night shift. Being all alone in an empty store with no light but a little office in the back is scary enough. Now let's fast forward till around 1 a.m. I'm sitting on my chair by the front when I hear one of the radios turn on in the back office. It's not uncommon for them to go off once in a while, as they tend to pick up signal from someone else on the same channel. Not thinking anything of it, I tend to my phone when I hear it go off again, this time with a much stronger signal. At that point, I get up and walk toward the back office when I hear this low, grainy voice say, "I can see you." My heart sank into the pit of my stomach as I heard him say this, and it was then where I asked who it was. After getting no response, I glance over to the back exit of the store, and due to the glow of the red exit sign, I was able to make out the silhouette of a person. However, for some reason, I don't think they saw me, and I played dumb by looking the other way and turning off all of the radios. I wasn't just gonna go back to my post with someone possibly dangerous in the building with me, so I did the only thing I could do. Right then, I turn around and start booking it toward the front entrance as I heard whoever it was trying to catch up. Thankfully, I made it out the door, locking it behind me. A few seconds later, I see this tall man dressed in all black run up to the front and put his hands on the window. He was not a pleasant-looking man. His eyes were wild and his grin was menacing. At that point, I called the police, where they thankfully arrived in a few minutes, where they went inside the building. However, like in most situations like this, whoever was inside the store with me was gone. Police concluded that they had simply left through the emergency exit. Needless to say, I continued my shift while a patrol car stayed in front just in case whoever it was came back. Till this day, I still can't get that man's face out of my head. It's just something you can't unsee. I stayed at that job for a month later before landing a new one that paid more and didn't require night shifts. I've never seen or heard from that man again, and I really hope it stays that way. While all of this was indeed a scary situation, one question still comes up that I can't seem to figure out the answer to. The store had several cameras that had night vision, and not one of them picked up the man by the exit, even though they were pointed at it. The police and I reviewed the footage and saw no one in the store, other than me. That was the reason as to what made me so scared, and it's also the reason why I will never work another night shift again.
Right now, I'm an 18-year-old female. This event occurred when I was 11 or 12 years old. I still remember the day, December 1st. This is what led to my parents and I to have to get an alarm installed. One day my dad and I were home. I was in the living room watching Drake and Josh's Christmas special. Yeah, I remember exactly what I was watching. My dad was in the shower. It was just a regular casual afternoon until the doorbell rang. I paused the movie because, for me personally, we always lower the volume or pause the film when we have an unexpected guest. I was taught well enough to not open a door for anybody. If it was someone I knew that my parents told in advance, I would have opened the door, but this day, it was an unexpected guest. After I paused the movie, I ran to my room to look out the window to see who was at the door. My bedroom window is literally right next to the front door, so I can easily see who's there. But at the same time, it's easy enough to get caught. So I slightly pulled down the blinds, not giving away my position, and saw 2 black women standing there. After seeing them, I shrugged it off. I was thinking maybe they're promoting or selling something. I walked back to the couch and I waited a few more minutes. While I continued to watch the movie for the next few minutes, my heart dropped at what I saw at the back door. It was the 2 women, just standing there. I sat there frozen and unaware of what to do. Thankfully, my dad just finished showering and was entering the living room at the same time. He yelled, "Hey!" before running after them. Of course, they ran off. But my dad tried his best to capture the 2 women, but he couldn't catch them. A few seconds later, I heard tires screeching, which I assumed was their car. I wasn't entirely sure if it was just the 2 of them alone or if they had someone else in the car waiting for them. Whatever the case may be, we didn't encounter them again. I had no idea what their intentions were in the first place. Were they there to potentially rob us, kill us? Probably not, because I didn't see anything. No weapon, nothing. Anyways, I'm just glad that my dad and I are safe, as well as the household. We told my mom when she got home from work later that night. About a week or 2 later, we had an alarm system installed. The question still roams around my head when I think about this event is, why? Why us? Anyways, I'm glad that all of it was over. And wherever they are, I hope they didn't continue their actions and change their behavior for the better.
5 years ago, when I was in high school, we were having a very normal day. I was in my 5th hour class, which was my last class of the day, so I was excited to go home. It was gym class, and we happened to be outside playing Foursquare in one of the parking lots behind the school. It wasn't that long into the game when suddenly our teacher, Mr. Watson, told us all to stop our games and listen up. He announced that the school was in a lockdown, and we all needed to go inside and he would get us to a classroom. I wasn't too excited about this, and I was afraid we would be locked down until after school was supposed to get out. Mr. Watson began waving us all inside, and as he was distracted, I saw an opportunity to run away and get to my car. I know it was a dumb thing to do, but I was scared of the lockdown, and I was already outside, so I decided to make a run for it. Mr. Watson didn't even notice me leaving, and I began making my way to my car. At our high school, it costed a lot of money to park in the school parking lot, so they had a free one that was farther away that I parked at. The only problem was to get there was maybe about a 10-minute walk, and it went through the woods a little bit. I jogged down the path and through the woods. I had to stop and start walking to catch my breath from the run. I stopped to text my best friend Casey that I had left the school and asked what the lockdown was for. As I was standing there on the path though, I started to hear some noises coming towards me. It sounded like another person running. I figured it was another student running away like I had to go to their car. I looked into the direction of the noise, and I could see through the trees where the path curved that it was a grown man running. Immediately I got a bad feeling, and I jumped behind a tree in the woods. The man slowed down and came around the corner. I held my breath and hoped that he wouldn't see me. He had dark hair and a goatee, and walked a ways past me. He kept looking over his shoulder, and then it sounded like he went into the woods because I heard trees and brush being moved around. Then the noises stopped. I waited there and was hoping to hear him walk away, but I heard nothing. It sounded like he had gone just inside the woods, about 30 or 40 feet down the path from where I went in. The trees were pretty thick in this area, and it was a good place to hide, but I didn't dare move or make a sound. I really just wanted to go to my car and drive away. I realized the mistake that I had made by running from class now, but it was too late to do anything about it. I sat there for a few minutes, and I knew the man was still there, but I was sure that he hadn't seen me. I debated in my mind between running back to school or trying to make a run for my car, but they both seemed pretty risky, and I didn't want to take a chance. So I remained hiding there, trying my best to stay silent, because any movement I made would make noises with all the trees and branches in there. I occasionally heard noises from where the man had gone in, pretty much confirming to me that he was still there. After what had to be at least 5 to 10 minutes of hiding, I started to hear police sirens off in the distance. They got closer and closer and seemed to be heading for the school. The sound of those sirens made me feel a little bit safer and more brave, so I then decided I was going to run back towards the school. I took a deep breath, and on the count of 3, I made a run for it back to the path towards the school. I heard the man start to move in the woods when I started running, but I couldn't tell if he was chasing after me or moving in another direction. I didn't look back at all and ran my fastest until I had made it up to the school. I saw the police officers arriving, and I ran up to one of them and told them about the man in the woods. They had me wait with some other officers for a while. The man had made a run for it, but he ended up being caught a short time later deeper into the woods. Apparently he had been trying to get into the school and had actually broken a window. My mom came and picked me up, and I had to get my car later when the area was cleared for us to return.
Back when it was originally released, I really wanted to get my hands on a new Xbox One X. You know the one. It was 4K ready with a considerably faster processor. So naturally, I tried absolutely everything in my power to get one as immediately as I could. My local Walmart was having one of those Black Friday sales, and like so many others, I stood patiently in line, waiting to try and beat the rush to grab one. But I was nowhere near sprightly or fortunate enough to actually get one that way. So after failing to get one in person, I then tried getting one online. But as rapidly as I wanted one to own, the users who were reselling them were asking way too much money, and I simply couldn't afford to shell out double, or sometimes triple the price. After weeks of trying to find a way to get a hold of one, I had to come to the conclusion that it just wasn't to be. It was then that I had something of a stroke of luck. Although I had resorted to Craigslist in my desperation, I did actually find someone that was selling their Xbox One X at no more than the original buying price of the console. Naturally, I was skeptical. For the life of me, I simply couldn't fathom why they would do something like that, but one thought overrode all others. If I didn't put in a bid now, someone else would, and I could kiss my chance of owning a One X goodbye. I immediately emailed the seller and let them know that I was very interested. Not only that, but I had the cash on hand and was ready to go. I also offered to pay for gas or whatever it would take to get the console delivered to my door. I figured that would be a pretty appealing offer to someone who I guess was just strapped for cash around the holidays. I was stunned to get an almost instantaneous response, stating that they did still have the Xbox and were in fact still waiting for a proper bid from a serious buyer. They politely asked for a delivery address so they could bring it over as soon as possible. I was sort of hesitant to divulge such personal information and asked if it would be a better idea to first meet in public since it was much safer that way. I'll be honest, I wasn't too pleased with the idea of a total stranger coming over to my house, but he informed me that he was going to be very busy running holiday errands all day and that there would only be some pretty specific windows of opportunity to drop it off. It would be much more convenient for him if he was about to come over to my house. I was still not particularly ecstatic about the idea, but oh man, I really wanted that new 4K Xbox. So in the end, I agreed and texted the dude my home address. I figured it was safer than me going over to his place. At least this way I'd be on home turf. I was so happy and eager to get my hands on that new console, and that excitement only grew as I began waiting for the guy to turn up. But he took his sweet time. I mean, hours and hours passed by before I began to suspect that he wasn't going to actually show. Around 1 in the afternoon, 4 hours after he was due, I was seriously losing my cool, thinking it was a prank or something. I tried texting the guy back, asking him where he was. Previously, I had gotten pretty timely responses from the guy, but This time I didn't hear a single thing from him. By 6 that evening, I just lost all hope. I assumed that he got a better offer from someone else and didn't have the heart to tell me he picked a new buyer. I was disappointed, more than words can possibly describe. I got myself so psyched, and I can't even tell you how deflated I was. It's one thing not to have gotten the item from the store. I could come to terms with that. But I was so close to having one in my hands, it sucked having my hopes dashed so cruelly like that. And that didn't mean I'd given up entirely. So for the rest of the night, I kept looking around on Craigslist and other sites to find a new Xbox One X that was within my price range. But as I was getting ready to wind down for bed, I heard something. At first I had dismissed it as the wind or something, that it was maybe just my imagination. But then I heard it again. Someone knocking. Not at my front door, but lightly on the TV room window. I walked up to the bedroom window and peered out into the driveway, seeing this strange-looking dude at my front door, looking around as if checking the coast is clear. I'm suspicious, but I go downstairs to see what he wants. He identified himself as the guy who had the Xbox, apologized for being so late, and explained he had gotten backtracked with errands during his day. Then he casually asked if I still had the money. I opened the door all the way, but still kept the screen door closed as a precaution. Something just didn't feel right, like at all. I told him that, yeah, I still had the cash on me, but I didn't see that he had anything with him, so I calmly asked if he had brought the Xbox with him, like if it's still in his car or anything. As expected, he told me it was out in his van. He told me to get the money and come out to the van with him and he would get it for me. I let him know that I wasn't really comfortable walking out to his van, but he seems to understand and tells me it was all good. I briefly look over the guy's shoulder and see that there is in fact someone else sitting there in the van. Not only that, but the dude at my door has been keeping his hands concealed in the little front pouch of his hoodie the whole time while talking to me, and there was definitely something more than just his hands in there. Don't ask me how I could tell. I just could. You know when you just get a gut feeling about something? Yeah, that. I tried to stay as chill as possible, as I lied to him that I'd just go fetch my wallet and return in a minute. His mood immediately changed as I closed the door in his face before locking it. I then make the split-second decision, better to be safe than sorry, so I pull my phone out of my shorts and dial 911. But as I do, I heard a loud thud on my front door, then the sound of the van's engine revving before it zooms off into the night. When I went to check and see if he had damaged my door, I nearly peed my pants when I saw a rusty old hatchet buried in the wood. I was right that he had something in his sweatshirt, and that I shouldn't go out to the van with him. Be careful who you're buying from, folks. You never know who's behind the username.
Fucked at a Walmart, mostly stocking shelves late at night. It was pretty easy and was really the first real job that I had. One night, I happened to be working at around 11 o'clock p.m. We were still open at that time, but we would rarely get many customers then because we closed at midnight. I was in an aisle where we sold pet supplies at the very back end of the store, just stocking a shelf. I heard somebody walking close by and then saw a man enter the aisle and start to approach me. I really didn't like when customers would ask me questions, but I would always do my best to answer them. He came closer to me, and when he did, I noticed that some of his clothes were ripped, and he seemed a little bit off. He said to me that he had a question for me. Then he began to ask something, but never really got to the question. He stopped himself and slowly said to me that he didn't like me. His face changed to an angry look. I had no idea what to do, but I figured this man had to be on some sort of drugs. He slowly walked behind the aisle we were in. I just shook my head and went back to work, but I could tell that the man was just standing there, barely around the corner. As I took products out of boxes and placed them on the shelves, I noticed out of the corner of my eye the man stick his head around the corner for a second and then go back. He still had a very angry look on his face. I did my best to ignore him and figured that he would walk away soon enough. About 5 minutes passed by, and as far as I knew, he was still there. Then out of nowhere, several items came flying off the shelf near me as if they had been pushed from the other side. Now this annoyed me. I said in a firm voice to the man that he should just get whatever he came here to get and leave. What he said in response was that he was going to get me, and then he called for me to come around the corner to the other side. I ignored it and started to pick up the items that fell. He called out a couple of more times for me to come out, but I just ignored him once again. About a minute later, I heard the sound of more people in the aisle next to mine. It sounded like 4 or 5 men were suddenly in the aisle. I decided to walk over and look, and saw several police officers start to take the man away. One of the officers walked over to me, and I asked him what happened. He told me that that man had assaulted somebody in a nearby restaurant a few blocks away in a seemingly random attack, and then fled. He was found at the Walmart. It seemed like he was going for me next.
So for context, I'm a 22-year-old male, and I live in a large city in the Midwest. Now, I drive for Lyft while putting myself through trade school. I also drive for other similar companies, but that's besides the point. I have many horror stories from those as well, but I'll tell those another time. It was Christmas Eve 2020. I was out driving for Lyft for a few hours before heading to my mom's with my new baby and wife. Nothing really special going on for the night, just the usual. I get a ride request. It happened to be a pickup from this kinda lower income apartment complex. No big deal. I arrive, find my passenger, and he has all of his belongings with him, like several boxes of stuff. Now, my car is a 2006 Chevy Impala, so it's not really too big. We get all of his stuff loaded up, barely, and we're on our way. Now during the ride, the guy was crying and saying that his girlfriend was cheating on him, and he had apparently walked in on them earlier that night. He couldn't stay there because her name was on the lease, so I was taking him to a hotel. Now in my city, we happen to have a street that is pretty well known for having vices. Hookers, drugs, gangs, weapons, and shady motels. You know, the works. We get to the motel and he asked me to wait for him to check in and get his key. No problem, man, I say. I'll confess, I break the rules a little when it comes to Lyft. I have a gun hidden in a concealed holster, secured to the underside of my driver's seat for protection. Reason being, driving Lyft and other contract apps, I've had knives and guns pulled on me, as well as having people trying to fight me, rob me, and all kinds of other things. But like I said, stories for another time. This motel was on that street that I had mentioned before. Homeless people were everywhere. There was a dude on the far corner of the complex that still had a needle in his arm, passed right out against the building. And I'm a pretty big fan of true crime and horror narration, so I'm on edge. He gets his key. The whole motel is ground level, so to help the guy out, I drive to his door. As I mentioned before, he had a lot of stuff, so I started to help him unload his stuff. While on my second trip getting stuff, I saw a guy come out of a room just south of my car, then followed by 2 ladies. They came up to the room I was next to. One of the ladies then pounded on the door, then opened it. That's when I then saw the guy raise a fucking shotgun right out of his long coat and then storm into the room. The 2 ladies followed him, then slamming the door behind them. Following, I heard a lot of yelling and shouting. I was honestly just waiting for shots to ring out. Out of nowhere, my passenger came up behind me. "I can take this, man. Go ahead and take off. Have a Merry Christmas." And he gave me a cash tip. I didn't even notice that he took the boxes out of my hands or slid a $5 bill in my pocket. I was frozen. I knew what may have been going down in that room. I had to leave, or at least go to where I could get my gun. I know that the guy and the ladies both saw me, and I know that they knew I saw the gun. I just had to get the fuck out of there. You know how it goes. No witnesses. I got in my car and then sped away as quickly as possible. I got a block or so away and then called the cops. I gave them every detail I could. After I got off the phone with the police, I signed out a lift. I hadn't made much money, but I was done. I got a call later that night. The cops investigated. They never found the gunmen or the women. They never answered the door that I saw them come out of. And the occupants of the room they went into said nothing happened and that I was full of shit. Well, I definitely wasn't. I know what I saw.
One scary day, my mom and I went to Subway for a quick snack. When we reached our destination, we got out of the car and went inside. Inside, I sat at a table near the only window there. I'd always liked the window seats. My mom was ordering, and I was just watching like the little stalker I was. But as I watched my mother deal with the cashier, the situation seemed to get weird. I could hear them talking from where I was, when I suddenly heard the words sex and children. I was starting to get nervous, so I went up to the counter and rested my arm on my mom's head. I'm a lot taller than my mom. The cashier looks at me with an angered look and says, "Who the F are you?" I hadn't even said or done anything, and he's treating me like that. I'd gone to anger classes before, and I did pretty well. But even still, it took everything I had just to say, "I'm her son." Why? I wanted to say so much more to someone that rude. The cashier was wide-eyed. "He's your son?" My mother said yes. Then the cashier pretended that nothing happened, even though I wanted to snap his freaking neck. My mom saw my anger and said to calm down. I just didn't know why this guy was being so disrespectful. The cashier is staring at something under the table, and I look suspiciously at him and look over the table. The cashier noticed me looking at him, so he lifted his head up fast, like he was looking at something in secret. I was still trying very much to fight the anger from this rude person. I don't know what he and my mom had been talking about, but he still had no reason to treat us like he did. Suddenly, and I still have no idea what set this guy off, maybe he was crazy, he pulls out a pistol that he had apparently taped under the counter, and he began to point it at the two of us. And when he did, I let anger take over me, and I jumped over the counter and began fighting with this guy. I felt like if I didn't, someone was going to get hurt, and I wasn't going to give up until that gun was out of his hand. Taking quick glances to check on my mother, she seemed extremely surprised, and she was still like a statue. As I'm struggling with the cashier, he whips the arm holding the gun toward my head, and I flinch and feel something smash into me. It hurts, but I don't stop fighting with this man. My mom at this point was running out of the store, and before I knew it, I feel another crushing thud against the back of my head, and then everything slowly got dark. I came to in a hospital bed. Confused, I got up, but at that moment, the only thing I felt was pain. I dropped myself back onto the bed. A doctor walked in and said that I had a concussion. He told me not to worry, that I'd be fine within about a month. All I have to say is that I'm glad I didn't get shot. We are, along with several others, pressing charges against this freak. Apparently, the guy just snapped, and no one knew he had been hiding a weapon in the store.
Back when I first moved away for college, my mom and dad bought me this beat-up old Toyota Matrix so I could drive home whenever I'd wanted. I grew to hate the old piece of trash after a while, but it got me from point A to B, and it helped me get a job as a delivery driver for a pizza place, so I'll always appreciate the gesture. But then one night, when I was making a delivery, something happened that meant that from that night on, I never got into the driver's seat of it ever again. So, like I said, I'm making deliveries one night, and I'd just gotten back into my car after dropping off a bunch of pizzas at an apartment building when I suddenly realized I hadn't locked the passenger side door. And the only reason I realized I hadn't locked the door was because this guy opens up the door and climbs into my car. Then right as I'm about to tell the guy to get out, I see he has a gun. I'm too scared to even say anything, and he just points it right in my face and says all out of breath, "Drive." As I'm pulling into the street, literally trembling in my seat, I see these two cops sprinting out of an alley in my rear view, and that's when it hits me that they were probably chasing him, and they probably had enough time to call in my license plate. Turns out I was dead right about that, because the next thing I know, I see flashing lights in the rear view. I didn't even have to look over at the guy. I just see him raise the gun up, pointing it at me, and he says, "If you stop this car, I'll blow your head off." So I drove and kept driving until we were out in the suburbs. The whole time the cops are tailing, and they're not shouting like "pull over" or whatever through their bullhorns or whatever you call it. And I figured it's because they know that the guy basically carjacked me and that there's a hostage situation going on. The whole time the guy's like, "Drive faster." And all I can say is, "I can't. This thing's a piece of trash. If I put my foot down, the engine might freaking give out." So he's content to just delay the inevitable for as long as he could. I don't know exactly how long we were driving because the little digital clock was busted, but after a while we started to see fields and stuff. Then my gas light starts blinking, and I tell the guy that if we don't at least try and stop for gas, that we were eventually just going to come to a rolling stop. He tells me to stop at the next gas station we see, so that's exactly what I do. But not before the guy uses his phone to call 911, telling the operator exactly what's going on, and to tell cops that if they come near the car while we're topping up our gas, he's going to kill the hostage, i.e., me. We eventually pull into this gas station in the middle of nowhere, and I'm absolutely terrified. But I ask him if he wants me to get out to top off the tank. He looks around and sees it's one of those pumps that stays locked unless you pay first, so he says no. But he has to think of something out before he lets me get out of the car. The cops are keeping a safe distance while this is going on, as they obviously thought the guy was straight up ready to kill me. And I'd be lying if I said I didn't think that too. The whole time they're shouting over their mics like, "Let the hostage go, we can work something out, and no one has to die over this, Malcolm. Just surrender, and we'll get you help." He's stalling the whole time, pointing the gun to my head every so often to warn the cops off, and I swear that every time he did it, I thought he was going to pull the trigger and just end it. But looking back, if he did that, the cops would have just swarmed the car and shot him, or at least I think they would have anyway. Then there came a point where I could see that he was trying to work out how to get out of the mess he'd gotten himself into. He knew he couldn't get out of the car to get the clerk to unlock the pumps, as they'd ran for cover as soon as they saw that it was a dangerous situation, and there was no way for him to get their attention. Then he seemed convinced that if I got out of the car, I'd run off to the cops, like, right away, which, to be fair, was my #1 escape plan at the time. He asked me how far we'd go if we just took off with the gas I had in the tank, and I told him about a mile or two, not far at all. And he lets out this real deep sigh, like a balloon deflating or something, which I suppose was exactly what was happening. He was all out of ideas. He knew this was the end of it, and right then, I realized that was the point that he was at his most dangerous. I was pretty much convinced that I was going to die by that point, having gotten it into my head that the guy was going to just go out in a blaze of glory by shooting me and then unloading the rest of his ammo onto the cops. And then when I heard him say himself, "Screw it," and he did something to the gun, like cock it or take the safety off, I thought to myself, this is it. This is how my life ends, in a trashy car with some loser maniac. I shut my eyes, felt my hands gripping the steering wheel so hard I could feel it shaking, and then bang. Only a second later, instead of feeling, well, nothing, I found I could open my eyes. But the first thing I saw when I opened them was a few specks of blood on the dash near the passenger side. Then when I turned, I instantly started dry heaving, because the guy had obviously put the gun in his mouth and pulled the trigger, because there was a ton of blood and chunks of brain matter all over the ceiling of my car. I opened up the door and was puking with my hands raised above my head while I heard the cops shouting, "Get down on the ground." I had to lie in my own puke, man. Just lie there while they ran over with their guns on me just in case I was somehow in on it. It sounds crazy, but I really didn't mind. Knowing it was all over, that I was safe, well, relatively anyway, it was all gravy by that point. Like, I don't even think I can really describe that kind of relief in actual words. I literally felt high off of it. You see and hear about people crying in the aftermath of stuff like that, and I guess that's just how they deal with the emotion. But to me, it kind of felt like I'd won something. Like I beat the carjacker by surviving or whatever. Anyway, I better sign off before this starts sounding too abstract, but I can definitely say I wouldn't wish that kind of experience on anyone. Ever.
I am a driver for DoorDash. This happened just a couple of months ago. It was a Thursday night and I was working late. I typically worked until 2 a.m. on Thursdays, and it would be a pretty good money-making night for me. It was late and I was almost done, but at about 1:30 in the morning, I got an order to pick up. It was at McDonald's and it was just a medium drink. It seemed a little weird to me that somebody would have just a drink from McDonald's delivered, but I wasn't going to question it. I went to McDonald's and picked it up, then I drove to the destination. It wasn't that far, between 5 and 10 minutes away, but when I got into the neighborhood, I could see that it wasn't the best area. The houses looked very run down and old, and the grass in most yards was very long. I turned onto a dead-end road and finally reached the address. It was at the end of the dead end, and I could barely see the house because of how dark it was, combined with how many trees they had in the yard. There was a woods surrounding the house, and no street lights or house lights. I slowly stopped my car and got out. I looked around. It was very quiet. I walked to the end of the driveway of the house and looked down it. It was skinny, but fairly long. It had pine needles and sticks all over it, and looked like it didn't get much use. I looked down and saw the house, and then I began walking. I got about 10 feet down the driveway, and then I heard the branches in a tree next to me start to move. Immediately when I heard the sound, I knew it couldn't have been an animal and had to be a human. Without even thinking, I placed the drink on the ground, turned around, and ran back to my car. As I was running, I heard movement behind me, but I didn't stop to look. I ran all the way back to my car and got inside. When I did, I immediately started my engine, and the lights to my car came on. Out of my windshield, I saw in front of my car about 30 feet away, there were 3 men. They were not chasing me anymore, but they were just standing at the end of the driveway looking at me. Then one of them turned and threw the McDonald's drink at my car. It hit the ground about 5 feet in front of my vehicle. I backed up my car and drove away. I hope I don't have to deliver to that neighborhood again. I'm a pizza delivery driver. This was by far the scariest thing to happen to me. It took place about 1 year ago. I was working on a Thursday night, which were usually decently busy. I made quite a few deliveries, and the later it got, the more things calmed down. At about 1 in the morning, I got a delivery for a cheese pizza. I put it into my car and drove to the location, which was about 10 minutes away. It was in an area of town which I rarely delivered to and was a little more run down. I got to the address, which was a 2-story house with a pretty decent-sized yard and many overgrown plants and trees. It looked a little bit run down like most houses in the area and had a front porch that seemed to wrap around the house. I got out of my car, grabbed the pizza, and walked up the driveway to the house. Then I walked up the steps to the door and rang the doorbell. About 30 seconds went by, and I was about to ring the bell again when the door started to open. A man answered. He was fairly large and bald and looked to be in his 50s. He just stood there staring at me for a second. I said I had his pizza and handed it to him. He looked almost surprised and said, "Oh, okay, that's nice." Then he just looked around. He just seemed a little bit strange to me. Then he said to me that he had to get some cash to tip me and he would be right back. He went back inside and closed the door. I stood there waiting for a good 2 or 3 minutes, but the man still didn't return. I was thinking about just leaving when I heard some noise and figured the man must be coming back. But when I listened closer, it wasn't coming from inside. It was coming from outside on the porch. I looked around to the direction of the noise. Then I saw from the side of the house on the porch 3 men approaching me about 30 feet away. I guess it was just an instinct, but as soon as I saw them, I turned and sprinted back down the porch to the driveway. When I did, I heard all the men start to chase after me. I ran as fast as I could to my car and unlocked it and then jumped inside. I frantically started the engine and stepped on the gas. As soon as my car started moving forwards, the men reached me. I felt one of them kick my back door and another one tried opening the door on the other side, but I was just barely able to drive away. I sped out of the neighborhood and all the way back to the pizza place. I have to think that the pizza delivery was some sort of trap to lure me into getting robbed, or maybe even worse. I haven't delivered to that area much since, but when I do, I'm extra careful.
I used to work the late shift at a Walmart here in Jacksonville, and every night after finishing at like 1 in the morning, I'd walk to the exact same bus stop to call an Uber. Now, this whole story would never have happened if my dumb self didn't just get picked up from work. But I always like having a smoke as soon as I finished, and it wasn't the kind of thing that management would have taken kindly to, me smoking right outside of the Walmart. It was the arrested and fired kind of smoke, so I used to walk to the bus stop. Anyway, this one night I'm sitting there, smoking away, and the Uber is maybe only 3 or 4 minutes away. Seconds later, when I see the dude in the distance walking towards the bus stop, I immediately started getting bad vibes. Getting bad vibes from people when I was smoking up was hardly anything out of the ordinary, but I still figured that I'd keep an eye on him as he walked past, just in case he tried anything funny. He walks past me, but only by a few feet, and then he stops and leans against the bus stand like he's waiting for the bus with me. Now, I know well that there's no bus coming, so why is he just standing like he's waiting for one? That's when the bad vibes about the guy seriously intensify, because he was definitely acting weird. The only question was if they had any bad intentions for me. I'm getting more and more nervous watching the little blip on my phone screen getting closer and closer, and as much as I'm trying not to make eye contact with the guy, I can see him looking over at me every so often, like he's sizing me up or something. I'm feeling pretty thankful by the time my Uber rounds a corner and I start to see its headlights. But as it pulls up, I actually think that maybe my paranoia might be starting to get the better of me, and maybe it's just me being the judgmental one instead of the guy actually posing any kind of threat. Then literally, as I open the door to the Uber, the guy says, "You lucky kid." I look back, and he has this grin on his face that literally made my skin crawl. That's when I realized he did actually have something in mind for me. I don't know what it was, whether or not he planned on robbing me or just beating me up or whatever it was. I just know it wasn't good, and I thank Christ that my Uber showed up when it did.
I live in a small studio apartment. I like my place a lot, even though it has some details that always made me really nervous living here. The wall facing the street is basically just a giant window, and I also live on the 2nd floor, so my window is very close to the streets below. The marquee looks very easily climbable and gives direct access to my window. Even though that makes me a little uncomfortable, nothing really ever happened, and it just stopped bothering me a couple of months after I moved in. That is, until last week. Last Monday, I woke up at around 2 a.m. to go get some water to drink. Since the kitchen is right next to the side of my front door, I could hear something coming from the corridor as I filled up a cup. It wasn't coming from another apartment or from the streets. The noise had that very specific reverberation from an empty corridor. I approached the door and could make out that the sound was actually some kind of trap beat playing on repeat. At first, I thought maybe that was just some drunk guy messing around with his phone before getting to his apartment, but after laying in bed again, I could still faintly hear the same beat coming from the corridor. It kept playing and playing until I fell asleep about an hour later. 7 a.m. rolls around and I'm woken up by someone ringing the doorbell. It was a cop. A bunch of them, actually. The landlord and some of my neighbors were also there. Even with the place really crowded, it was really hard to miss the trail of blood that went from the corridor window to the far end of the wall. The cops said that someone was leaving for work early in the morning when they came across the blood smears and then immediately called the police. He questioned me and the neighbors. The place was scrubbed and we went on with our lives, but I couldn't stop thinking about it. Every single day I always come home and walk over where the blood was, and I always wonder what the heck happened in the corridor that night. Now, I was a little bit uncomfortable living here before, but now I'm definitely really spooked out. I wonder if I'll ever figure out what happened.